Why you don't need the atonement. I want to do this video this week because it's December, there's lots of Jesus talk, and I want to separate what I see as inspiring about the homeless historical mystic named Jesus who spoke in parables and never wrote anything down, and the God that we created out of him with virgin births, which is something that we do with people and gods when we want to make them special. We don't want special people coming into the world in the vulgar way the rest of us do with sex and a messy birth. And also, claims of atonement and resurrection and second coming. I want to separate what is worth listening to from Jesus, especially during Christmas time, from the God that we and the empire that we created in his name. So I want to specifically talk about today the atonement and how we develop this idea that Jesus atoned for our sins and why this is extraordinarily bad for us, particularly for women and children. So, this discussion has to start with scapegoating. Scapegoating is an ancient human practice rooted in the need for transferring fear or guilt or blame onto an object or person, which then brings harmony to the community. We even see that primates do rituals like this when there is guilt, when someone went too far. And so, this isn't even just something that we see in humans. We see this ritual in processing guilt and shame in primates too. So for humans, we see this, in the Middle East, where in Leviticus 16 on Yom Kippur Day, a high priest places the sins of Israel onto a goat, and then that goat is driven into the wilderness, taking away the sins. And we may look back and say, well, that's silly, but rituals, especially communal rituals like this, really do reset the good vibes of a tribe. And there is value to the ritual, even if it's just a ritual. In ancient Athens, marginalized people were often expelled or sacrificed during plagues or disasters in order to purify the city. It's a way to do some kind of communal ritual to reset the vibe and give some semblance of control in a world that just has so much chaos. Many indigenous cultures worldwide practice sacrificial rituals to appease gods or spirits in order to restore cosmic balance. My favorite story is the story of the 15 or 16-year-old Inca girl that we call the Maiden, and it's one of the most fascinating archaeological finds related to the Inca Empire. And her body, along with two other children, were discovered in 1999 at the summit of a volcano in between the border between Argentina and Chile. And it's one of the best preserved mummies that we have. And so the children were part of this Inca sacrificial ritual to honor the gods and ensure harmony with the natural world and the spiritual world. So the maiden was most likely chosen for her, physical purity and perfection, which is a very common criteria for sacrificial offerings. The DNA analysis suggests that the children were not related and that they probably come from elite families across the empire. So months before the sacrifice, the children were, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I find it so interesting. The children were taken to the Inca capital of Cusco, where they participated in ceremonies and feasts and rituals. We know, because these mummies are so preserved, we know that they were given a diet that was really rich in maize and llama meat, and that it was better than the diet that they were having before. So they were kind of a part of a lot of feasts in Cusco, the capital. And then they were probably sedated with coca leaves and a fermented maize drink before their deaths in order to ease their suffering as they were placed in the volcano. Now, we look back on child sacrifice and say like, well, that's a little bit barbaric, or that probably did nothing but kill some children. But it is a ritual that has some kind of value for human tribes to try and control the chaos, process guilt or shame, and it seems to unite the tribe as well, which is why it shows up as an evolutionary advantage in cultures all across the world. So the atonement builds not only on, Jewish sacrificial traditions, but it's a lot more ancient of a human practice than Jews killing goats. If Jesus was God and Jesus died, and God died on the cross, they really had to reconcile with what that meant. And so early Christians interpreted Jesus's death as the ultimate and final sacrifice, fulfilling this Jewish sacrificial system and ending the need for ongoing atonement rituals. And so his innocence is supposed to amplify the symbolic power of his death, akin to earlier scapegoating practices, but now universalized for everyone. But it's not as clear cut as that, because the question always remained, even back then, why did he have to die? Why did God need to sacrifice himself to forgive his creation that he created? After all, I can forgive you without any additional violence or sacrifice needed. So, does that mean that I can do something good that God can't? So, Christianity develops many theories. There's four main ones. I'm going to talk about seven. I think I have six or seven in my list, because there is no single atonement theory. There is no single Bible anything really, to try and explain why Jesus needed to die. So I'm going to go through the atonement theories real quick, just really short, just so you can see the development of this idea, and then talk about why we need to outgrow this idea in general. So the earliest theories that we get are the ransom theories, which is second to about 4th century. And this is rooted in writings of Origen and Gregory of Nyssa. And this theory suggests that Jesus' death was a ransom paid to Satan, who held humanity captive due to sin. And we still see this language, even though it's rooted in very old and superstitious ideas. Maybe I shouldn't use superstitious there. Mythological ideas of cosmic struggle and transactional justice. This view is not as popular today with Christian apologists because it kind of puts Satan as the same power level as God and kind of makes God look like an asshole or not as powerful as Satan, if Satan has the power to claim us forever. But that was, about 2nd to 4th century. That would be the common explanation for why God had to die, is because that was the ransom that was paid to Satan because Satan owns us. And then in the 3rd to 5th century, we get this new theory popularized by Irenaeus that shows Jesus as this victorious hero. So this is the Christus Victor theory. And rather than individuals kind of being owned by Satan, now we're talking about Jesus as a victorious hero, defeating the powers of sin and death and the devil conceptually. So rather than Satan owning individual people because of sin, it's more that Jesus defeated the conceptual concepts of sin and death. Like he opened that door first so that all of us could open that door. And so this is Christ as victor over the concept of sin and death. And then that kind of hangs out for a while. And then we get to the 11th century, which is where we get medieval feudalism. And this influences atonement theory at the time. And so this is proposed mostly by Anselm of Canterbury, where he sees sin as a debt against God's honor. And so Jesus' sacrifice satisfies God's wounded honor and restores the divine human relationship. And this makes sense when the world is about feudal relationships to your king and what you owe your king as far as debts and promises. And so that's a very kind of feudal way of looking at it, but that's where we get satisfaction theory, where Jesus' sacrifice satisfies God's wounded honor that we owed him as our king. Then we get moral influence theory in the 12th century. And this originates with Peter Abelard, and this theory emphasizes that God's death is a demonstration of God's love, inspiring humanity to repentance and moral transformation. And this is the first time where we seem to be able to outgrow as humans the idea of like divine wrath or cosmic transactions. And this one is still quite popular because it makes it so that it wasn't about sin, it wasn't about Satan. It was about how God loved us so much that we were able to see God's love on the cross in the execution of an innocent, in the crucifixion of God's Son. It's so shocking to our morality because it's so wrong that it essentially turns us to God. It shocks us out of our usual way of life, and then we become more loving as we turn towards a loving God who allowed this to happen, to show us that one can love and forgive even on a cross, and that God gave his favorite son to us. And so it turns us towards morality. So that's an interesting idea. I still hear apologists talk about that in that way. And then we get the penal substitution, which is by far the most popular, I think, in Protestant Christianity. And we get this around the 16th century. And this is really starting to be based in a legal system as countries are developing full legal codes and systems of justice. And so in the Reformation era, this is going to be championed by John Calvin. This theory reframes Jesus' death as a legal legal penalty. So Jesus absorbs the punishment that's meant for humanity, which satisfies divine justice because God must be just because he's perfect. And you sinned, so Jesus must pay for your sin. And so this is the dominant atonement theory in Protestant traditions. In my own church background, you can tell which apostles in my church come from a legal background, like which ones are lawyers, because lawyers especially really clamp onto this legal view of Jesus and God as balancing the scales of perfect mercy and perfect justice, as if this was an actual kind of cosmic court of law. And so we see this coming out of the 16th century. And then prepare for some mental gymnastics, we get to nonviolent atonement in the 20th century. Because in the 20th century, we have these developing nonviolent atonement theories because God requiring violence just doesn't sit well with modern ethics. So we have, the traditional atonement theories like penal substitution or satisfaction often present God as requiring some kind of violent sacrifice in order to reconcile humanity. And this implies that God's justice demands punishment for sin, and that Jesus's violent death satisfies this requirement. And then critics say that this makes God seem angry and punitive and at least complicit in this sacrificial violence. And so nonviolent atonement offers an alternative interpretation. This is a little bit, it's a stretch, but stay with me. So nonviolent atonement theory views Jesus's death not as a required sacrifice by God, but as an exposure and rejection of the human tendency towards scapegoating itself. So Jesus is portrayed as innocent, but he's condemned by, the religious and political authorities. He becomes the ultimate scapegoat, and his crucifixion reveals the injustice of scapegoating, that the victim is not the cause of society's problems, but a projection of human fear and human violence. And so this scenario is acting as a mirror to show us what we are. And so unlike traditional scapegoats, Jesus doesn't retaliate or perpetuate violence. Instead, he forgives his executioners and says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then Jesus in that way breaks the cycle of violence and exposes it as unnecessary. And so he's showing us this mirror. And by kind of accepting what humans do and doing it with grace, he essentially exposes this practice of scapegoating as unnecessary. And so in nonviolent atonement, God is not the one demanding Jesus' death. Instead, God is aligned with the victim, who is Jesus, and showing solidarity with all the oppressed and calling humanity to abandon violence altogether. So that one takes a little bit longer to explain. In my opinion, there's some mental gymnastics to make that work because that's not how most people will kind of think about the atonement. But you can see over time Christianity's wrestle with both the benefits of scapegoating to the community, but also the moral problems that it brings up when God seems to require or allow this level of violence. So why do I think this is a bad idea? After all, isn't it better to have a symbolic lamb so that we can outgrow throwing actual virgins in volcanoes? And if rituals are good for the community, is it a good thing for humanity to have this idea of Jesus's atonement? I think not, for three main reasons. Number one, lack of moral responsibility. The idea of the atonement externalizes personal responsibility by suggesting that someone else, Jesus, can pay the price for your wrongdoings. And this can, even though people will say that's not what it's about, it easily sets up a get out of jail free mentality where people feel absolved of accountability simply by believing in Jesus' sacrifice. And this can be incredibly harmful. It bypasses the critical process of introspection, taking ownership of your actions, and true moral growth comes from acknowledging harm, making amends, and committing to better choices, not outsourcing consequences to someone else. And it can also create a false sense of security where people feel forgiven without addressing the real world impact of their behavior on others. And so a healthier approach, with all that we know from modern psychology and relationships and human thriving, involves directly facing consequences of one's actions, practicing restitution, and then fostering empathy for those harmed. So a great example is my grandma. So my grandma, she's active Mormon. She still is. She's still alive. And she was a a pretty rough parent. So both verbal and physical abuse to her children. And her children, all, you see signs of trauma. You see addiction. You see that none of them have healthy relationships. I mean, her impact as far as trauma and her lack of any emotional safety or physical safety from her 5 children, you can actually see the effects of that when you look at that family tree, when you look at my family tree. And one time I was staying up late with her and I was talking to her and I was just being really safe. I just want to get to know her more. I just want, she's my grandma. And finally it's like midnight. I've been like so kind. I've been so gracious. Like I feel like she's really starting to take her walls down. And I figure this is my one chance to ask her this question. And I look at the wall. She has like, pictures of the family on the wall. And it's all, this guy's divorced three or four times. Here's children from this marriage. This guy's an alcoholic. This guy's in jail. It's a pretty messy family calendar or family tree. And I ask her in this moment of vulnerability that I have with her, do you ever look at your family here, these pictures, and have any kind of sting of sadness at how your family tree turned out? And, she looked down for a second. She said, one time I was feeling really shitty. And she said the word shitty, which is pretty rare because she's active Mormon. I'd never heard her swear before, so I remember it. And she said, there was one night where I was feeling really shitty about my failures as a mother and about, how my family turned out. And what she did is she prayed to Jesus and she asked Jesus to take the weight of that away from her. And she did feel, lighter. She felt like Jesus had, took a lot of that as she's in this prayer situation, trying to process this guilt and shame over her failures as a mother. And I relay this eventually to my mom, and realize that because she, in that moment of guilt and shame, had someone to put it on, then she essentially took that guilt and shame, which should have brought her closer into relationship with her children. She should have been saying sorry to her children, but instead she just put it on Jesus, and then Jesus took it, and now it's not her responsibility. It's not her sin anymore. So she doesn't have to think about it. She doesn't have to experience consequences from it. She doesn't have to do anything about it because Jesus owns that sin now. And that really hurt my mother because, my mother left the church, and so she doesn't, believe in the atonement. But to know that her mother felt bad about her failures and the emotional and physical abuse, but instead of saying sorry to any of them, never said sorry to any of them, and just put it on Jesus and moved on with her life, brought my mother a lot of pain because she needed to hear that. Her inner child needed to hear that I'm sorry for yelling at you. I'm sorry for making you scared when I chased you with a broomstick or whatever it was. And people will say, Christians will tell me, well, she's using the atonement wrong. You're not supposed to use it like that. But it opens the door for that. That's what scapegoating does. It enables you to use that get out of jail free card. And so my grandma used it in that way. And to this day, will probably die never having said sorry for the effects that because of the abuse and the devastation that you can see in her children and their children and now their children. Will never have to make restitution for that because Jesus has it. And that is so harmful. That is so harmful. It is far healthier and safer for everyone and better for everyone if she would have taken that moment of guilt, and if Jesus wasn't there, make a phone call to those children to tell them that you were sorry. Like that's what should have happened in that moment. All right, number 2, it protects perpetrators and harms victims. So atonement theology often frames suffering and sacrifice as redemptive or even necessary. And this can perpetuate harmful cycles where victims are encouraged to forgive without justice and perpetrators avoid accountability under the guise of divine forgiveness. And we see this every single day in Christianity. Not a day goes by without a headline that is talking about this. And so why is this harmful? We're pressuring victims to let go of their pain without proper healing or justice, which re-traumatizes them and also makes them feel broken because like, why isn't, I'll have women come to me saying like, why isn't working? Why I'm apparently a bad person because I can't just forgive and move on, but they never got the healing or justice that they needed to be able to do that. And then perpetrators use the atonement as a way to evade actual real world consequences of their actions, because if God is above, governments, then as long as you're good with God, then government doesn't need to be involved. And so believing that they're cleansed without repairing, they believe that they're cleansed without repairing the damage that they've caused. And this theology can normalize suffering and sacrifice as virtues, and really lead to dangerous, abusive dynamics in relationships and systems. We should be prioritizing systems that validate the experiences of victims, seeks justice, and holds perpetrators accountable. So it is true that the atonement works as a ritual to help you process guilt and shame. There's a reason that we, use goats to do that. It actually does work in some way. But here's the catch. It only works in that way for the perpetrator to do a ritual to put something behind them. And the atonement does not work for victims, which is why I see women in the hundreds, maybe even at the thousands at this point, who come to me and say, I keep getting pressure from my church and my family to forgive and access the atonement, and then I'll be just totally healed. But my body is screaming at me that I don't want to forgive, and I'm traumatized, and I'm certainly not experiencing this magic healing that somehow undoes trauma to the brain. And so maybe I'm just broken. Maybe I'm just bad. And this is why, for example, in Mormonism, when there's child abuse, the bishop is not required to call the police. The bishop calls the attorneys at the church office, and the attorneys tell them, do not call the police, but work with both sides of this situation for them to access the atonement. So the bishop works with the child abuser without telling the congregation that this man shouldn't be around children, without telling the government. And voila, the atonement wipes the slate clean for the abuser, and then the attorneys come in with non-disclosure agreements for the victim so that the situation doesn't put a bad name on the church itself, and they're paid with tithing money to keep quiet, and then the victims are told to access the atonement for their trauma. And the wife of the abuser is specifically told that Jesus invites you to forgive your husband and move on here. And the victims, they don't get access to therapy, because what can therapy do when you have the magical atonement? And then the kid who was abused is fucked up for the rest of his life, or her life, or whatever, and is shamed for ever speaking out on it, because you need to forgive and you're holding on to the past and you're not letting it go. Like, of course they're not letting it go. They've never been validated. They've never gotten help. And so you can say that this happens on an individual level or just with Mormons, but no, this is an institutional reality for Christian churches. Each church has a history of using the atonement in this way. It helps perpetrators, particularly men, particularly with abuse, and it damages women and children, especially, both as victims and also in forcing them to forgive and have no negative consequences to the husband who is involved in the sexual abuse. I see it every single day. There's not a day where this is not a headline somewhere in the world of Christianity. Number 3, it reinforces harmful ideas about human worth and shame. So the concept of atonement is built on this premise that humanity is fundamentally broken and sinful and needs external saving to be acceptable or loved by God. And so this reinforces feelings of shame and inadequacy, which can lead to a distorted self-view. It teaches people that they are not enough on their own, and that they need to value divine forgiveness or the death of another in order to be enough, in order to be able to be worth any kind of love. And so instead of empowering individuals to take ownership of their growth, recognize their inherent goodness, the atonement theology kind of frames them as inherently broken and flawed. And so this undermines a healthy sense of self-worth and promotes dependency on external salvation rather than internal transformation or personal accountability. So focusing on self-awareness and empathy and ethical living is a much more constructive path to human flourishing, without relying on this narrative that you're inherently broken and need something outside of yourself to fix you. And so we see this with how Christians cannot accept like affirmations or self-love or credit if they do something inherently good for someone else. All good things have to be God, not you. And all bad things are humans. And it creates a distorted view of yourself. And so if everything is good, everything that's good in the world that's in me, or just in the world in general, is God, but there's rampant suffering and problems with me and in the world, Christians don't say, maybe God could have created a better system than this. No, it's always God is perfect. He created everything perfect. We suck. We humans messed it all up. We're bad. Anything slightly good, if God helps you find your keys, it's God. But when 5 million, children die of starvation this year, that's because humans are bad. We did that. And so even though God is perfect, he apparently created imperfection, and we have to hate ourselves for being what God made us to be. And again, this is why Christians have to be so loud in the free will conversation. So everybody else is having conversations about the free will issue, but Christians are screaming that we have to have free will. We must have free will. And you see why, because the religion is based on this idea that God made the Garden of Eden for us, but we ruin everything with our bad choices. But if you lose free will, then God just looks like an asshole, because then it's his fault for placing us in, for creating us to be what we are, and placing us in situations where we would inevitably end up in heaven or hell. And he kept creating people anyways, even knowing that they would have to end up in hell based on their circumstances if people don't have free will. Anyway, that's a topic for another day. Essentially, what I want to say is that maybe for the first century, it was an improvement that we stopped putting kids in volcanoes, or we stopped sending goats in the wilderness to starve, and we move forward into a symbolic ritual of scapegoating. Perhaps in the first century, that really is a step up. But today, it's time to make another step in evolution, particularly with all the data that we have, that not calling police and therapists, and instead telling women and children to just access the atonement and forgive it, and it'll all magically go away. We know that this idea causes immense harm in the Christian world and immense psychological damage. We have to see the atonement for what it is: scapegoating as part of an ancient ritual, maybe even a primate ritual when humans didn't know any better. But now we have Brene Brown and therapists to process guilt and shame. We have better tools. We can claim moral responsibility, and that it's actually the most moral thing to do, to not put that wrong thing that you did onto someone else like my grandma did, and instead fully try to correct your error and take full responsibility for it. And some say, well, that's what the atonement does. It helps us with this atonement process, which includes making amends with the person wronged. But if that's all the atonement is doing, helping you make amends, then just make amends. Like, nobody needs to die. And we certainly don't need to worship a God that can't do something good that I can do, which is I can forgive someone else without added violence. We don't need more violence demanding gods in this world. We have enough violent gods in this world. So for my home church with my kids, just yesterday on Sunday, I read to them the Good Samaritan story, and we talked about how sometimes people who challenge us to see others as humans like us, even people who are different, that can make people mad. That can make institutions mad that you're challenging their definition of us versus them. That can make political institutions mad that you see other people as human. And he was killed for being a political and religious rebel. And I didn't teach them that they are fundamentally broken. And this scene of violence and thorns is nails, and nails is God's love in some weird, twisted way. And I didn't teach them that if they did something wrong, just pray about it and give it to Jesus. And I didn't teach them that Satan is trying to get them at all times and shooting his arrows at you, but Jesus is fighting Satan in this epic mythological battle that is actually real. No, I just taught them the story of the Good Samaritan. And the Jesus that I know from my master's degree in theology and decades of study in the historical Jesus, that Jesus would have rathered me tell my children that story anyways. So stay here for more no-nonsense spirituality. Next week, I will do my atheist Christmas message that I do every year. I do a different message every year. And this is the last week that all my courses are 50% off with the code BRACES for my kid who needs braces. And so if inner work is the gift that you want to give yourself or someone else this Christmas, check that out too. And I'll see you next week for my Christmas message. Thanks, and let me know what you think in the comments.